Everyone, I am Yumirada. I am Lorena Esquipiles. I am Gazia Tumala, and we are the discussants of Chapter 13, Balance of Payments, Debts, Financial Crisis, and Stabilization Policies.
Total worldwide debt has never been higher, and yet there's little sign of this current wave retreating anytime soon. Now, with the coronavirus outbreak being declared a pandemic, governments have announced hundreds of billions of dollars in stimulus packages that will send debt even higher. So just how worried should we be if it all comes crashing down? Global borrowing has been growing rapidly. So rapidly that many are concerned it is quickly becoming unsustainable. The Institute of International Finance estimates total worldwide debt, which is made up of borrowings from households, companies and government, surged to a staggering $253 trillion at the end of September 2019. That's a whole lot of debt, more than 3 times the annual economic output of the entire world. It works out to roughly $32,500 of debt for each of the 7.7 billion people on the planet. What's more, the group says this figure is only going to increase. The World Bank believes the speed and scale of this debt wave is something we should all be worried about. So much so, the group has urged governments around the world to make it a primary concern. But let's take it a step back. Put simply, debt is created when one party borrows from another. It allows individuals to buy something they wouldn't normally be able to afford. That has its benefits. For example, you might take on debt when you get a loan to buy a car or mortgage on a house. This allows you to pay back the cost of those investments over time instead of all at once. The cost of this service is the interest rate. At present, interest rates around the world have fallen to historically low levels. This has made it cheap to borrow from banks, meaning businesses can make large investments and homeowners don't need to spend as much on their monthly mortgage payments. There are drawbacks to a low-rate environment though. Individuals aren't likely to see much of a return on their savings, and both people and businesses could load up on too much cheap debt, something we're seeing now. Governments take on debt too, which they can use to stimulate the economy by funding infrastructure projects, social programs, and more. How much a country's government owes is known as sovereign debt. Sovereign debt is very different to how we might think about debt as an individual. But one thing they both have in common is that problems tend to arise when that borrowing becomes excessive. Loans to countries with developed economies, like Canada, Denmark or Singapore, are generally seen as safe investments. That's because even if governments spend beyond their means, lawmakers can raise taxes or print more money to ensure they pay back what they owe. But loans to governments in emerging markets are generally seen as much riskier, which is why these countries will sometimes issue debt in a foreign, more stable currency. Although this allows them to attract more investors from abroad looking for bigger returns, an economic slump, weak home currency, or a high debt burden can make it difficult for the government to pay them back. Ultimately, the most important risk when it comes to national borrowing is that a country may fall behind on its debt obligations and default. This isn't common, but it has happened. Take Lebanon in 2020, Argentina in 2001, and Russia in 1998. Over the last 50 years, there have been 4 waves of debt accumulation. We're currently in the midst of the 4th wave. So, what can we learn from the first 3? Well, for one, none of them have had a happy ending. Let's start with the first wave. In the 1970s, many Latin American countries began to borrow extensive amounts of money from US commercial banks and other creditors to support their development. It didn't seem like a problem at the time. Interest rates were low and Latin American economies were flourishing. But in the background, the debt wave was rising. At the end of 1970, the region's total outstanding debt from all sources added up to $29 billion. By the end of 1978, that number had shot up to $159 billion. 4 years later, it more than doubled to $327 billion. In the 80s, major economies began hiking up their interest rates as they battled inflation. Oil prices were sliding and the world economy was entering a recession. In 1982, the starting gun of the Latin American debt crisis was effectively fired when Mexico announced it would not be able to service its debts. This move quickly sparked a meltdown across the region, with the fallout spreading to dozens of emerging economies worldwide. Many countries in Latin America were forced to devalue their currencies to keep exporting industries competitive in the face of a sharp economic downturn. Between 1981 and 1983, Argentina weakened its currency against the US dollar by 40%, Mexico by 33%, and Brazil by 20%. Ultimately, 27 countries had to restructure their debts. 16 of them were in Latin America. The second wave ran from 1990 through to the early 2000s. It was unlike the first in that debt accumulation in the private sector played a much more prominent role. In the late 80s and early 90s, many advanced economies deregulated their financial markets. The policy changes led to many banks consolidating, and these bigger banks' operations became increasingly global. This helped prompt a massive surge of capital into emerging markets, with falling interest rates and a slowdown in advanced economies also fueling the surge. Developing economies began to rack up a lot of debt, most notably Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. Yet, this growing wave of debt went largely unnoticed. You see, debt was growing rapidly, but so was GDP, meaning the ratio between the two stayed consistent, and most of the debt was hidden in the private sector. A currency crisis in Mexico in 1994 thrust international investors back into panic mode, with the country's default a decade earlier still fresh in people's minds. Yet, while a $50 billion bailout from the US and the IMF meant Mexico was narrowly able to avoid a default this time around, it wasn't enough to stop panic spreading to other countries. It led to an abrupt stop and reversal of capital flows in 1997. By this point, Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand had developed a dependence on borrowing. Coupled with several policy failings, this helped usher in a crisis in East Asia's financial sector and ultimately another global downturn. While those impacted by the Asian financial crisis recovered, international borrowing carried on at a brisk pace. Enter the third global debt wave, which lasted from 2002 to 2009. At the end of the previous century, the United States removed barriers between commercial and investment banks, while the European Union encouraged cross-border connections between lenders. This paved the way for the formation of so-called mega banks. These banks led the way in a sharp increase in private sector borrowing, particularly in Europe and Central Asia. Defaults in the US subprime mortgage system piled more and more pressure on the country's financial system, pushing it to the brink of collapse in the second half of 2007 and 2008. The shockwaves reverberated across the world, with one economy after another falling into deep, albeit short-lived, recession. In the US, the 2009 recession was so severe that output from the world's largest economy sank to its lowest level since the Great Depression. The World Bank says we're currently in the midst of the fourth wave of global debt. And if we're to avoid history repeating itself yet again, governments must make debt management and transparency a top priority. This wave of global debt is thought to share many of the same characteristics as the previous three, including prolonged periods of low interest rates and changing financial landscapes which encourage more borrowing. But the World Bank has called the current wave the largest, fastest, and most broad-based of them all. It involves a concurrent build-up of both public and private debt, involves new types of creditors, and is much more global. However, as the coronavirus pandemic threatens to sink the world economy, the moment for stemming the tide may have passed. Thanks for watching. If there are any other topics you think we should be covering, please do let us know. See you next time.
In this chapter, after looking at countries' balance of payment accounts and recent trends in developing countries' trade balances, we will examine the dimensions and effects of debt crisis in developing countries. We will examine in depth how major debt crises emerged during the 1980s and into the 1990s, and why debt remained a serious impediment to growth in Africa for 2 decades or more after the crisis hit. Debt crisis is a situation in which a country is unable to pay back its government. A country can enter into a debt crisis when the tax revenues of its government are less than its expenditure for a prolonged period. These crises are of exceptional importance because of their scope and impact on slowing the development progress of dozens of developing nations over a protracted period. And much has been learned from years of careful study of the lessons from these experiences. The crisis was addressed first in Latin America and how it was finally addressed much later in Africa, and in the process who bore the burden of stabilization and structural adjustment programs induced by the International Monetary Fund and supported by the World Bank. The IMF promotes global macroeconomic and financial stability and provides policy advice and capacity development support to help countries build and maintain strong economies. It also provides financial support to countries hit by crisis to create breathing room as they implement policies that restore economic stability and growth, and also provide precautionary financing to help prevent crisis. Next is some of the smaller but significant international crises that emerged in developing countries over the subsequent decades, particularly the East Asian crisis of the late 1990s, and consider how adverse impacts of international debt crisis on developing country citizens might be minimized or prevented. We conclude with an in-depth review of the 2008 global financial crisis that began in the United States but had major direct and indirect impacts on all developing regions. We see how ongoing conditions have potential to lead to future financial crises. The 1969 Philippine Balance of Payments crisis was a currency crisis experienced by the Philippine economy as a result of heavy government spending linked to Ferdinand Marcos' campaign for his second presidential term in 1969. It was notable for being the first major economic crisis of the Marcos administration and for triggering the social unrest, which was the rationalization for the proclamation of martial law in 1972. The Philippines began the 1970s with debt rescheduling and an IMF-sponsored stabilization program, the product of fiscal expansion and short-term borrowing during Marcos' first administration. Philippine respondents also considered a debt crisis as the second biggest risk as the government borrowed heavily to fund its coronavirus pandemic response. The national government's outstanding debt stood at a record of 13.644 trillion pesos as of the end of November. As of the end of September, the government's debt to gross domestic product stood at 63.7%, still above the 60% threshold prescribed by the multilateral lenders. So, what is the debt to GDP ratio? The debt to GDP ratio is the metric comparing a country's public debt to its gross domestic product. By comparing what a country owes with what it produces, the debt to GDP ratio reliably indicates that particular country's ability to pay back its debts. Often expressed as a percentage, this ratio can also be interpreted as the number of years needed to pay back debt if the GDP is dedicated entirely to debt repayment. The higher the debt to GDP ratio, the less likely the country will pay back its debt and the higher its risk of default, which could cause a financial panic in the domestic and international markets.
The Philippines government debt has consistently been a figurative issue that has been conversed throughout recent years. This is likely being driven by two factors, the first of which is due to the government overspending either through its annual budget or because of its infrastructure-driven administration, which promised a $180 billion development plan across the archipelago nation of the Philippines. The second of which is because of the recent COVID-19 economic crisis, which was likely a black swan event and has affected the entire world's economy. But the government's Build plan, which was introduced way back in 2016, was a mega initiative, and it might not even sound quite a lot compared to other nations, but when we compare it to the Philippines' nominal gross domestic product of that year, we can see that the nation had only a nominal gross domestic product of around $318 billion, estimated by the World Bank. Hence, we have seen the potential disastrous debt burden that the nation of the Philippines would undertake had it fully encompassed this well-known Build initiative. Well, it did, and so we have seen the population of the nation drive into fear. Further, the nation of the Philippines' total debt, as measured by the last available data as of the time of the video's writing in March 2022, saw that the Philippines' debt has ballooned to a record high of around $229 billion. Presumably, presumably pushed by government spending as it battles out economic worries and also the nation's continued drive for infrastructures. Yes, despite all of the fear across the world that even some nations had gone to default because of their debt, the Philippines continues to borrow money to fuel its ambitions. One significant loan as of this video's writing was when the Philippines government and the Regional Development Bank, also known as the Asian Development Bank, had signed the first tranche of the whopping $4.3 billion loan to fund one of its biggest initiatives known as the South Commuter Railway Project. With such issues, we are likely to see the nation of the Philippines' debt rise. But here's why we think the Philippines continues to push for such an initiative regardless of debt issues. We can measure it using the debt to GDP ratio, which is a measure of how much debt the nation has in contrast to its gross domestic product. This is stated by some economists to be one of the best, if not already the best way to measure a nation's debt burden. The debt burden is not really estimated by how much the government has incurred so far, such as its $229 billion record high, as this can be easily paid down as long as the government sees its GDP growth, along with other measures such as tax revenues and so on. So getting back, we have gathered data from the Bureau of the Treasury of the Philippines, which shows that the Philippines, despite everything that has happened thus far, has a debt to GDP ratio of 63.5% as of the first quarter of 2022, which was a ratio last seen since 2005. This is likely an awful moment in the nation's history, but not really the worst moment in history. You see, the debt to GDP ratio of the Philippines was actually far higher throughout the last decades. From 1990 to 2000, the Philippines had a minimum debt to GDP of around 51.7 and even as high as 74.9. This would imply that across the three-decade history from back then and today, the Philippines has managed to strive against its debt problems and build its economy stronger. Furthermore, in addressing the issues of how the Philippines' debt ballooned in recent years, data from the time this build was introduced in 2016, the Philippines had actually a debt to GDP of around 42.1%. And by the time it had gone to 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic, the Philippines' debt to GDP has actually shrunken to just 39.6%. But as soon as the economic crisis hit, things became far different. So was it because of COVID-19, or was it because of the overspending of the government on its infrastructures? Well, it can be both. After all, it still continued to spend on its ambitions while the crisis was happening. But was it the right choice to do? Well, that would only be truly answered after the Philippines has fully been successful in its mega initiatives and can overcome its debt burdens. This is why it can lead us to the government's stance on its infrastructure drive. Why did the government not stop, or even slow down its spending as debt did balloon? Before we answer that, we must first note that the Philippines' debt to GDP ratio had decreased from 2016, the year which it introduced the massive initiative, to 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic. It has a 3-year time frame that saw big names be signed into law and some billion-dollar loans had been taken out. Yet the ratio had dropped from 42.1% to 2016. Well, simple. The GDP had grown far faster than which the government could borrow. This is why we think the government's top leaders and finance ministries have from time and time again noted that they can do what they have done in the past: outgrow its debt and have enough money to pay down incoming repayments. This was from the incoming Finance Secretary Benjamin Diokno, who had expressed his confidence in the nation to be able to easily outgrow its debt, as long as, noted, the nation grows at least 6 to 7%, which it had done continuously in the past, with the first quarter of 2022 seeing an 8.3% growth so far. A separate expert on this topic, the current sitting Finance Secretary Carlos Dominguez, has also told the new government administration to rather place an emphasis on tax initiatives, such as raising tax rates. But this was repelled by Diokno, who was again confident in growing the economy rather than focusing on tax rate hikes. Furthermore, a topic that has also not been presumably properly adjusted to the public's view is separate confidence matters. This means we may not even just rely on the government's trust on driving economic growth. But just like Japan, which has an enormous debt to GDP ratio, it can confidently outweigh its debt because of its enormously large inventory of foreign reserves. The Philippines, which is in the same position, has as of April of 2022 around $106 billion of these foreign reserves. Furthermore, the Philippines' total debt is majority owned nationally and a lack of foreign debt. Of the total debt stock, only 30% was sourced from foreign entities, with 70% being loaned by the very people of the nation. And does that matter? Yes, according to some economists and experts. As Paul Krugman, an economist from the United States, once said about the US's gigantic debt, we owe it to ourselves. It is just an idea that as individuals, the loans the government has is just from its people, and the nation's own citizens would be less likely to treat it as a financial asset. But as we are not economists, it is more difficult to talk about how this entirety of internal and external debt can play out for the Philippines and could only rely on the words of actual experts. So, knowing all these so far, is the Philippines' debt an issue? Or can we easily outgrow it and pay down the repayments needed in the coming years or decades? Or if we can actually grow our economy, will we see the Philippines' tax be increased within the coming years? This is in fact already big, considering that the nation has one of the highest across the entire Asian continent, with its individual taxable income being as high as 35% and corporations around 30%. Well, we really have to rely on the government's role in ensuring that the nation does indeed outgrow its debt and has enough money to pay down incoming interest repayments. Further, we also think that the new government should be cautious, especially the fact that the US is on the verge of a recession, as it is always known that whenever the Western giant does indeed see negative GDP growth, it affects the entire world. With the Philippines a nation that relies on the US heavily, this may indeed be a hurdle to overcome. Moreover, we are also seeing inflation rising in the local communities and oil prices being a huge burden to the Philippines. And there are obviously a lot more problems down the line, but the government may not be able to go with its original plan of growing the economy. Then we may expect a further tax reform, which will likely be raised. But where do you think the Philippines economy is headed? And do you think the government can fully maximize its own plan to battle out incoming debt worries? Let us know down below.
The extension of our analysis beyond simple merchandise trade into areas related to the international flow of financial resources permits us to examine the balance of payments of developing nations. A balance of payments is a summary statement of nations' financial transactions with the outside world. A balance of payments table is designed to summarize a nation's financial transactions with the outside world. When a country imports more than it exports, it runs a trade deficit. A country that does the reverse, where they export more than it imports, they run a trade surplus. A trade surplus can create employment and economic growth, but may also lead to higher prices and interest rates within an economy. A country's trade balance can also influence the value of its currency in the global markets, as it allows a country to have control of the majority of its currency through trade. The capital account, or the financial account, records the value of private foreign direct investment, mostly by multinational corporations, foreign loans by private international banks, and loans and grants from foreign governments, as in the form of foreign aid, and multilateral agencies such as the IMF and the World Bank. It then subtracts an extremely important item, especially for the major debtor countries, and that is called the resident capital outflow. To put its importance in perspective, during the 1980s debt crisis, wealthy nationals from many developing countries sent vast amounts of money into developed nation bank accounts, real estate ventures, and stock and bond purchases. This capital flight is estimated to have had a value of up to half the total debt of some debtor nations at the peak of their debt problems. Capital flight is the movement of capital from a resource-scarce developing country to avoid social controls and is measured as net unrecorded capital outflow, or when a large number of people in a country move capital and assets from one country to another. It is usually in response to a political or economic crisis. It dwarfed the receipt of private and public loans and investments and was a major contributor to the worsening balance of payments of many developing nations. Capital flight is also a chronic problem where autocratic governments have a shaky hold on power. Capital flight from the Philippines was $16 billion in the 1970s, $36 billion in the 1980s, and $43 billion in the 1990s. Facing existing or projected balance of payments deficits on combined current and capital accounts, developing nations have a variety of policy options. For one thing, they can seek to improve the balance in the current account by promoting export expansion or limiting imports, or they can do both. Alternatively or concurrently, they can seek loans and assistance from the World Bank or the IMF. Traditionally, this has required that the countries follow very restrictive fiscal and monetary policies. These have been called stabilization policies by the IMF, and termed structural adjustments by the World Bank, which has made structural adjustment loans as part of this process. Stabilization policies and structural adjustment, both packages of preconditions of receiving loans, are popularly referred to as conditionality. These policies are designed to reduce domestic demand so as to lower imports and reduce the inflationary pressure that may have contributed to the overvalued exchange rate that slowed exports and promoted imports. In recent years, these institutions have shown somewhat less policy inflexibility, but it is not yet clear whether this trend will continue. In addition, developing countries can try to improve the balance on their capital account by encouraging more private foreign direct or portfolio investment, borrowing from international commercial banks, or seeking more public foreign assistance. The receipt of loan assistance implies the necessity of future repayments of principal and interest. Finally, developing nations can seek to modify the detrimental impact of chronic balance of payments deficits by expanding their stocks of official monetary reserves. One way of doing this is through the acquisition of a greater share of international paper gold known as the special drawing rights or SDRs. Traditionally, under the workings of the international monetary system, countries with deficits in their balance of payments were required to pay for these deficits by drawing down on their official reserves of two principal international monetary assets, which is the gold and the US dollars. But with the growth in the volume and value of world trade, a new kind of international asset was needed to supplement the limited stock of gold and dollars. Consequently, in 1970, the IMF was given the authority to create special drawing rights. Having summarized some basic balance of payments concepts and issues as they relate to both commodity trade and international flows of financial resources, we can now briefly review some trends in the balance of payments of developing nations and then focus our attention on a detailed analysis of debt problems. For most developing countries, the 1980s was an extraordinarily difficult period in their balance of payments accounts with the rest of the world. Prior to 1980, the conventional development strategy had developing countries operating with sizable current account deficits because imports of capital and intermediate goods were required to provide the machinery and equipment for rapid industrialization. Export earnings paid for most but not all of these imports. The financing of these deficits was therefore made possible by large resource transfers in the capital account in the form of country-to-country foreign aid, direct private investment by multinational corporations, private loans by international banks to both developing country governments and local businesses, and multilateral loans from the World Bank and other international development agencies. Meanwhile, a brief period of large current account surpluses, which reflected entirely the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, or OPECs, booming export revenues of 1979 to 1980, abruptly turned negative in 1981 and stayed negative until 2000 when they turned positive. The reasons for the decline in current account balances in the 1980s and 1990s included: number 1, a dramatic fall in commodity prices, including oil; number 2, global recessions in 1981 to 1982 and 1981 to 1993, which caused a general contraction in world trade; number 3, increasing protectionism in the developed world against export from developing countries; and number 4, some severely overvalued exchange rates in several key developing economies such as Argentina. This reversed in the 2000s with large current account surpluses in many middle-income countries. In most cases, these surpluses shrunk in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, at least temporarily. Thank you, Ms. Rada. Now let us discuss the accumulation of debt and the emergence of the debt crisis in 1980s. But first, let us define external debt. External debt is the total private and public foreign debt owed by a country. The accumulation of external debt is a common phenomenon of developing countries at the stage of economic development where the supply of savings is low, current account payment deficits are high, and imports of capital are needed to augment domestic resources. Prior to the early 1970s, developing countries' external debt was relatively small and primarily an official phenomenon, with foreign governments and international financial institutions such as the IMF, World Bank, and regional development banks serving as the majority of creditors. The significant proportion of loans were in concessional terms and were extended to fund development projects and increase capital goods imports. Although borrowing can be extremely beneficial, providing the resources required to promote economic growth and development can be extremely costly when poorly managed. For many developing countries, the costs have recently outweighed the benefits. The main cost associated with the accumulation of a large external debt is debt service. Debt service refers to the payment of amortization or the principal liquidation and interest. It is a contractually fixed charge on domestic real income and savings. Debt service charges rise as the size of the debt grows or interest rates rise. Debt service must be paid in foreign currency. That is why it can only be met by profit from exports, import restrictions, and additional external borrowing. Under normal circumstances, a country's export earnings cover the majority of its debt service obligations. However, if the composition of imports changes, interest rates rise significantly, causing debt service payments to balloon or export earnings decline, debt servicing difficulties arise. Due to this, it is important to understand the fundamental concept known as the basic transfer. A country's basic transfer is defined as the net foreign exchange inflow or outflow associated with its international borrowing. It is calculated as the difference between net capital inflows and interest payments on accumulated debt. The difference between the gross inflow and the amortization of past debt is the net capital inflow. The basic transfer is an important concept because it represents the amount of foreign exchange gained or lost by a specific developing country each year as a result of international capital flows. As you will see, the fundamental transfer became very negative for developing countries during the 1980s, resulting in a loss of foreign exchange and a net outflow of capital. For better understanding, we will show the formula for computing the basic transfer. But first, let us compute the net capital inflow. The net capital inflow is simply the difference between the gross inflow and the amortization and past debt. Let the net capital inflow, Fn, be expressed as the rate of increase of total external debt, and let D represent the total accumulated foreign debt. If D is the percentage of rate of increase in the total debt, then it will be shown like this. Since we now know how to compute the net capital inflow, we can now compute for the basic transfer. Because interest must be paid each year on the accumulated debt, let R equal the average rate of interest so that RD measures total annual interest payments. The basic transfer then is simply the net capital inflow minus interest payments, which can be shown like this. Basic transfer will be positive if D is greater than R and the country will be gaining foreign exchange. However, if R is greater than D, the basic transfer turns negative and the nation loses foreign exchange. In this regards, we will calculate the basic transfer of the Philippines based on actual data of its foreign debt for the year 2022. According to Philstar, the country's external debt rose by 4.5% to hit a record high of $111.27 billion last 2022 from $106.43 billion in 2021. With this, we can now compute the net capital inflow of the Philippines. And in order to calculate the basic transfer, we need the average rate of interest wherein according to the World Bank, the average interest rate of foreign debt as of 2022 is 12%. Now let us find out how much is the basic transfer of the Philippines. Upon computing, the basic transfer of the Philippines is negative 8,345,250,000 US dollars. Since the D or the percentage rate of increase in the total debt is less than R or the average rate of interest and resulted in a negative basic transfer, we can conclude that the country have loses foreign exchange. In this regards, any analysis of the evolution of and prospects for debt crisis require an examination of the various factors that cause rate of increase in the total foreign debt and the average rate of interest to rise and fall. The seed of the 1980s debt crisis were sown in the 1974 to 1979 period when there is a virtual explosion in international lending precipitated by the first major OPEC oil price increase. By 1974, developing countries had begun to play a larger role in the global economy with average annual growth rates of 6.7% from 1967 to 1973. Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, and Argentina, among other Latin Americans, had begun to import heavily, particularly capital goods, oil, and food. Following outward-looking development strategies, they aggressively increased their exports. In the face of high oil prices and a global recession, in which industrialized countries' growth rates fell from an average of 5.2% in 1967 to 1974 to an average of 2.7% for the remainder of the 1970s. Many developing countries sought to maintain their high growth rates through increased borrowing. It allowed developing countries to maintain relatively high rates of growth in an unfavorable economic environment with little debt servicing difficulty. It also facilitated the recycling of a massive surplus from oil exporters to oil importers by lending activities of private international banks, and it aided in dampening the recession in developed countries by increasing export demand from developing countries. Commercial banks, which held the majority of the OPEC surplus, which had risen from $7 billion US in 1973 to $68 billion US in 1974, eventually peaking at $115 billion US in 1980, and faced a low demand for capital from the slow-growing industrialized countries, aggressively competed in lending to developing countries on relatively permissive and favorable terms. Unfortunately, this success was short-lived. And in fact, the surge in international lending that occurred in 1974 to 1977 had laid the groundwork for all the problems that were to come. Now let us tackle the second oil shock, which occurred in 1979, brought about a complete reversal of the economic conditions conducive to the success of international lending in the previous period. Now developing countries faced an abrupt increase in oil prices that added to oil import bills and affected industrialized goods imports. There was also a huge increase in interest rates caused by the industrialized countries' economic stabilization policies and decrease in export earnings for developing countries, resulting from a combination of a slowed growth in the more developed nations and a precipitous decline of over 20% in primary commodity export prices. Moreover, developing countries inherited from the previous period a huge debt and debt service obligation, which was made even more onerous by burgeoning interest rate and more precarious as a result of the bunching of short-term maturities. Finally, during the entire period of debt accumulation, one of the most significant and persistent trends was the tremendous increase in private capital flight. It is estimated that between 1976 and 1985, about $200 billion fled the heavily indebted countries. This was the equivalent of 50% of the total borrowings by developing countries over the same period. Fully 62% of Argentina's and 71% of Mexico's debt growth are estimated to have resulted from capital flight. In fact, some researchers have argued that the 1985 level of Mexican debt would have been $12 billion rather than the actual $96 billion were it not for the huge private capital flight. Developing countries have two options in this critical situation. First is to curtail imports and impose restrictive fiscal and monetary measures, thus impeding growth and development objectives. Second is to finance their widening current accounts deficits through more external borrowing. Unable and sometimes unwilling to adopt the first option as a means of solving the balance of payment crisis, many countries were forced in the 1980s to rely on the second option, borrowing even more heavily. As a result, massive debt service obligations accumulated so that countries like Nigeria, Argentina, Ecuador, and Peru were experiencing negative economic growth in the 1980s and consequently faced severe difficulties in paying even the interest on their debts out of export earnings. They could no longer borrow funds in the world's private capital markets. In fact, not only did private lending dry up, but also by 1984, the developing countries were paying back 10.2 billion US dollars more to the commercial banks than they were receiving in new loans. Because of lower growth, higher interest rates, declining terms of trade for commodity exporters, and protectionism, many developing countries found themselves experiencing balance of payments difficulties in the early 1980s. These external problems were exacerbated by ill-conceived domestic policies which gave rise to large fiscal deficits, high inflation rates, and over-reliance on borrowing from international banks in the attempt to maintain growth after the oil shocks. This contributed to high levels of debt accumulated in the public sector and set the stage for the sovereign debt crisis of the 1980s. On the other hand, during 1990, many experienced positive net transfers, but others remained in crisis. Just after mid-1990s, the statistical picture became more complicated, with middle-income developing countries increasingly relying on foreign direct investment. Some crisis-affected countries most likely experienced negative net financial transfers. In World Economic Survey 1990 stated that for many developing countries, the 1980s have been viewed as a decade lost for development. The 1980s debt crisis truly made different countries suffer. Now let us see what the experiences of the Philippines in this 1980s debt crisis are. Let's proceed to the attempts at alleviation, macroeconomic instability, classic IMF stabilization policies, and their critics. First, let us define macroeconomic instability. Macroeconomic instability is a situation in which a country has high inflation accompanied by rising budget and trade deficits and the rapidly expanding more money supply. This had to deal with the IMF before a consortium of international banks would agree to refinance or defer existing loan schedules. Let us talk about now the IMF Stabilization Program. Relying on the IMF to impose stock stabilization policies, a process known as conditionality before it agreed to lend funds in excess of their legal IMF quotas to private banks interpreted successful negotiations with the IMF as a sign that borrowing countries were making serious efforts to reduce payment deficits and earn the foreign exchange needed to repay loans. For further understanding, stabilization policies refer to a coordinated set of mostly restrictive fiscal and monetary policies aimed at reducing inflation, cutting budget deficits, and improving the balance of payments. From early 1980s to 1997, various countries rely on IMF to address their financial crisis. During the early 1980s, numerous debtor countries with greatly depleted foreign reserves, including Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Bangladesh, and Ghana, had to turn to the IMF to secure additional foreign exchange. And when 1992 came, 10 countries had arranged to borrow a total of $37.2 billion in special drawing rights from the IMF. Regards to the Asian crisis of 1997, the IMF had to intervene with substantially larger sums of money in an effort to stabilize the shaky economies of Thailand, Pakistan, Philippines, Indonesia, and South Korea. The IMF became newly engaged in funding and stabilization packages in the wake of the global financial crisis, especially in various hard-hit Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union states in 2008 to 2010. IMF have often been viewed by leaders in developing nations as representing a double standard, harsh adjustment policies for developing country debtors and no adjustment of the huge budget or trade deficits for the world's greatest debtor, the United States. Furthermore, Cheryl Payer has argued that the IMF functions within a developed world-dominated global trading system as the chosen instrument of imposing imperialist financial discipline upon poor countries, and thus creates a form of international patronage. Payer emphasizes that the balance of payment problems are perpetuated rather than resolved. He further argues that the IMF encourages developing countries to incur additional debt from international financial institutions while it blackmails them through threats of loan rejection into anti-developmental stabilization programs. This added debt burden thus become a source of future balance of payment problems, setting up a vicious circle in which debtor nations have to run faster merely to stay in place. The goal of IMF is the maintenance of an orderly international exchange systems designed to promote monetary cooperation, expand international trade, control inflation, encourage exchange rate stability, and help countries deal with short-run balance of payments through the provision of scarce foreign exchange resources. Unfortunately, in a highly unequal trading world, the balance of payments problems of many developing nations may be structural and long-term in nature, with the result that short-term stabilization policies may easily lead to long-run development crises. Fears were voiced that if one or two or more of the major debtor countries like Brazil, Mexico, or Argentina were to default, if a group of debtor nations were jointly to repudiate their debts by forming a debtors cartel or a group of developing country debtors who joined together to bargain as a group with creditors. If more countries followed Peru's early initiative to link debt servicing to export earnings, the economies of Western nations might be seriously affected. Numerous proposals for relieving or restructuring the debt burdens of highly indebted nations have been proposed, with several implemented at least in part. For everyone's understanding, restructuring is the alteration of terms and conditions of debt repayment, usually by lowering interest rates or extending the repayment period. These have ranged from a new allocation of special drawing rights to restructuring to better terms for debtor countries of principal payments falling due during an agreed consolidation period. Most notable have been the Paris Club arrangements, offering highly concessional conditions, the so-called Toronto terms. These bilateral arrangements for public loans permit creditor governments to choose from three alternative concessional options: partial cancellation of up to one-third of non-concessional loans, reduced interest rates, or extended 25-year maturity of payments to generate cash flow savings for debtor countries. Third is the 1989 Brady Plan, which is a program launched in 1989 designed to reduce the size of outstanding developing country commercial debt through private debt forgiveness preferred in exchange of IMF and the World Bank debt guarantees and greater adherence to the terms of conditionality. For commercial banks, the 1989 Brady Plan linked partial debt forgiveness for selected borrowers to IMF or World Bank financial support, guaranteeing the payment of the remaining loans as well as commitments by the indebted developing countries to adopt stringent IMF-type adjustment programs, promote free markets, welcome foreign investors, and repatriate overseas capital. Next is the debt for equity swap. It is the mechanism used by indebted developing countries to reduce the real value of external debt by exchanging equity in domestic companies or fixed interest obligations of the governments for private foreign debt at large discounts. Commercial banks are now more willing to engage in such transactions because new interpretations and regulations for U.S. banks permit them to take a loss on the loan swap while not reducing the book value of other loans to that country. For the developing countries' part, they are able, through debt for equity swaps, to encourage private investments in local currency assets from both foreign and resident investors as well as to reduce their overall debt obligations. Much of the privatization that has occurred in Latin American debtor countries has been financed through these swap arrangements. For nature swap, which is the exchange of foreign debt held by an organization for a larger quantity of domestic debt that is used to finance the preservation of a natural resource or environment in the debtor country. It seeks to free up fiscal resources so that governments can improve resilience without triggering a fiscal crisis or sacrificing spending on other development priorities. Creditors provide debt relief in return for a government commitment to, say, decarbonize the economy, invest in climate-resilient infrastructure, or protect the biodiverse forests or reefs. It is intended to win commitments by a developing country's government to environmental preservation of such assets as the rainforest in Ecuador or a national park in Costa Rica. The problems with most proposals for debt elevation is that they require private international banks to initiate or endorse the policies. Most are unwilling to take any steps that would harm their short-run balance sheets and in the absence of debt repudiation by developing countries. For better understanding, debt repudiation is the policy that would hurt borrowers and lenders in both the short and long term. Most proposals except debt for nature and similar swaps do not solve the debt problem but merely postpone the day when debts become due and so another crisis erupts. All in all, the debt crisis underlined the interdependence and fragility of the international economic and financial system. It also demonstrated that not only were developing economies vulnerable to small increases in U.S. interest rates, but also that developed countries could be harmed by economic failures or public policies of the developing nations. Although many developing countries can be held at least partly responsible for the massive accumulation of debts, the adverse economic conditions this often causes are, in most cases, beyond their control. In fact, this adverse economic climate was in part precipitated by the industrialized countries' own economic stabilization policies, which led to soaring interest rates, worldwide economic recession, and the resulting decrease in demand for developing country exports. Now let us go back to the 1980s debt crisis. Many countries throughout the world experience hardship in this debt crisis. But how does this debt crisis come to an end? And what happened after this? Commercial bankers and financiers in the industrialized countries declared the debt crisis over with the signing of a Brady-type restructuring accord with Argentina in April 1992 and with Brazil in July 1992. But for many countries, especially in Africa, the problem remained extremely serious and would not be adequately addressed for another decade. During the year 1997 to 1998, fears of instability were renewed. South Korea, Indonesia, and Thailand, along with Russia, Brazil, and other countries, borrowed from the IMF under strong austerity conditions. In South Korea and elsewhere, public discussion centered on the view that austerity had led to unnecessarily large recessions, and in response, governments throughout East Asia and many outside it worked to accelerate exports repay IMF loans, and greatly expand foreign currency reserves over the subsequent decade. This process was greatly abetted by a dollar that was widely viewed as overvalued and accompanying record U.S. trade deficits which continued to increase. Now let us discuss further the odious debt and its prevention. Odious debt is the concept in the theory of international law holding that just as contracts signed under coercion are enforceable, sovereign debt used by an undemocratic government in a manner that is contrary to the interests of its people should be deemed invalid. Such odious debt would represent personal debts of officials of the regime that incurred them, not debts of the state that would be the responsibility of the nation's people. The concept has a long history. It was implicitly invoked, albeit without its present name, by Mexico following the overthrow of the French-backed Emperor Maximilian I and by the United States on behalf of Cuba in negotiations following the Spanish-American War of 1898, in which the United States abetted the rebels in the Cuban War of Independence while gaining long-term influence. Dictators widely alleged to have looted substantial public funds while incurring foreign debt have been found in every developing country. They include Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. of the Philippines, Jean-Claude Duvalier of Haiti, Mobutu Sese Seko of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Franjo Tuđman of Croatia. Many of these regimes and others, such as the apartheid government of South Africa, borrowed while also spending heavily on the apparatus of state repression. Figures Seema Jayachandran and Michael Kremer proposed an establishment of an independent international body to determine which regimes are illegitimate and thereby declaring as legally odious any subsequently incurred sovereign debt. As such, this debt would not be a legal obligation of successor governments. Of course, some unscrupulous lenders might still lend funds at high interest rates if they believe the regimes to be stable. But in general, these rules should limit dictators' ability to loot and repress while containing the debt burden of countries. Indeed, by substantially removing possible future defaulters from the loan pool, these rules could lead to lower interest rates for legitimate governments, who may expect a better long-term outcome to result for the people of developing countries. To ensure that no further loans are made to regimes that are considered odious, Jayachandran and Kremer point out legal incentives could be introduced on both the lender and borrower sides. Laws on creditor countries could be made to disallow seizure of a developing nation's assets for non-repayment of odious debt, and foreign aid to successor regimes could be withheld if they continue to repay odious debts. Note that we would not want new regimes to repay debts incurred by previous regimes after they had been officially designated as odious, because this would undermine the attempt to reach a new equilibrium in which such loans would not be extended in the first place. Jayachandran and Kremer suggest that the concept could be implemented in several ways. Although the proposed odious debt institution is forward-looking, the perception that some of the debt held by African countries can be characterized as odious is probably one of the reasons why debt forgiveness for highly indebted and low-income countries in Africa has gained such wide international support. So now let us understand further the HIP initiative. Heavily indebted poor countries is the group of the world's poorest and most heavily indebted countries as defined by the World Bank and the IMF, which status may make them eligible for special debt relief. The first problem to address the problem of HIPCs was launched by the Group of 8 major industrialized countries, or the Group of 8. They set up an elaborate process for qualifying for expanded debt relief through the international financial institutions, but by 1999, only 4 of the 36 poor countries initially deemed eligible had qualified. For eligibility, countries had to be classified as low income, which was discussed in Chapter 2. Face an unsustainable debt burden that cannot be addressed through traditional debt relief mechanisms, demonstrate by participation in IMF and World Bank-sponsored programs, a track record or reform and sound policies, and develop a PRSP. Progress on committing these funds was slower than expected, and the PRSP process, which will be discussed in Chapter 14, was considered relatively disappointing. Additional funds were committed in 2005. The G8 then agreed to set aside approximately $100 billion for enhanced debt relief for those designated HIPC countries that demonstrated to the satisfaction of the World Bank and the IMF that they were both pursuing sound policies and were committed to reducing poverty. Commitment was to be demonstrated through what came to be called poverty reduction strategy papers. As of 2013, of the 39 developing countries defined as potentially eligible for HIPC, 35 had reached their post-completion points so that they were receiving their full allocations of debt relief. Some official lenders are not participating in debt relief. Further, some countries in which debt has imposed hardship are not eligible for HIPC because they are above the low-income line despite having substantial levels of chronic poverty. So to conclude, great progress has been made for much of the developing world, but many countries remain vulnerable going forward. Now let us talk about the global financial crisis and the developing countries, which will be discussed by Ms. Kisia Tumala.
The Great Recession, which started back in December 2007, is considered the biggest financial calamity since the Great Depression of 1929. It was caused by unsustainable debt, which led to the so-called subprime loan crisis. Simply put, banks got greedy and lent money to people they knew would have a hard time paying them back. Furthermore, those loans were packaged and sold as financial products on international markets. Rating agencies considered them extremely safe, and reckless investors bought them without blinking. Insurance companies also got greedy and through credit default swaps promised to reimburse investors if something went wrong. Unfortunately, the inevitable happened and borrowers ended up no longer being able to pay the loans back. Needless to say, this caused the entire financial house of cards to collapse. Banks, as well as huge insurance companies, such as AIG, ended up on the verge of bankruptcy and were eventually rescued through bailout programs, financed by, well, by you and me. Unprecedented measures are still taken to this day in a desperate attempt to revive economies. Interest rates are at zero or even negative in most of the developed world, and central banks are injecting trillions into the financial system each year.
In the United States, one factor high on most lists was financial deregulation that was rapid and wide-ranging and careless in its design and implementation. The regulation came with repeal of rules separating commercial and investment banking without an adequate regulatory framework to replace it, failure to regulate newly introduced financial instruments, lack of enforcement of remaining regulations, and artificially low interest rates. A probable second major factor in the crisis was the chronic international trade imbalances between East Asia, notably China, and the developed countries, particularly the United States. With concomitant capital flows into the United States, this helped keep capital cheap and fueled the housing bubbles in the United States and some European countries. Now, for the first time in decades, sovereign debt problems were raised as possibilities in developed countries, most prominently for the so-called European Union 5, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Note that as recently as the early 1990s, 3 of these 5 were still classified as developing countries. Ireland and Greece required dramatic international bailouts in 2010, along with Portugal. They remain the largest IMF borrowers. Economic growth. In 2007 and the first half of 2008, developing countries were affected less than developed countries, but in the second half of 2008, the impact was quite severe in the most developing regions, continuing through 2009. As the 2009 World Investment Report put it, developing countries weathered the global financial crisis better than the developed countries, as their financial systems were less closely interlinked with the hard-hit banking systems of the United States and Europe. Both the IMF and World Bank stressed continued underlying fragilities and uncertainties, some due to factors unrelated to the developing world. A key example is the uncertainty caused by political conflict in the United States over fiscal policy, notably the threats to allow default on federal debt unless additional budgetary and programmatic concessions are made. Exports. Exports fell drastically in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. World trade volumes fell 14.4% in 2009, the largest drop in decades, but then rebounded strongly before returning to modest growth from 2011. Developed countries' austerity programs were a factor in their declining trade deficits. Going forward, to reduce its deficits, the United States has been widely expected to establish a higher savings rate while the dollar depreciates further, although the savings rate actually fell in 2013. Foreign investment inflows. A United Nations Conference on Trade and Development study concluded that the global crisis curtailed the funding available for FDI and noted that FDI inflows to developing and transition economies declined by 27% to $548 billion in 2009. Following 6 years of uninterrupted growth, while their FDI contracted, this grouping appeared more than resilient to the crisis than developed countries. Their share in global FDI inflows kept rising. For the first time ever, developing and transition economies are now absorbing half of global FDI inflows. Following almost a decade of uninterrupted growth, FDI flows to Africa fell to $59 billion, a 19% decline compared to 2008, mainly due to contraction in global demand and falling commodity prices. Developing country stock markets. At first, a flight to safety caused the volatility of developing country stock markets to increase greatly. But prices subsequently resumed their rise, and markets deepened in a few rapidly growing economies, notably China and India. Aid has risen modestly since 2001, but only a modest portion of the promised increases has been delivered, most likely due in part to the impact of the crisis and subsequent recessions in the high-income donor countries. But as aid remained below historical levels, other financial flows such as worker remittances, FDI, and portfolio investment flows increased by many times more than the declines in aid. Yet, for the least developed countries, aid is needed as much as ever. Distribution of influence among developing countries. There have always been divisions in the developing world. During the Cold War, countries were asked to take sides, aligning themselves with the United States and other NATO countries, or the Soviet Union or China. These conflicts spilled over to the non-aligned movement, which included countries with clear alliances. It is true that from the 1950s through the 1970s, there was a wide economic gulf between middle-income Latin America and low-income Asia. But economic inequality among the developing nations was not discussed. Most countries were growing but at a slow rate. This began to change as rapid growth in Asia spread from a few countries prior to 1980 to a majority of the region in the following 3 decades, while Africa particularly lagged. Even as the crisis accelerated, some developing countries, most notably China but also countries such as Brazil, found that they had increased global influence, but the growing economic inequality among developing nations became even sharper. Work remittances. Remittances to developing countries from migrant workers had reached a record $336 billion in 2008, though less than 10% of this went to the low-income countries. But this fell significantly in the aftermath of the crisis, followed by significant recovery. These remittances have been an important factor in the progress of poverty reduction in recent years, and the consequences will grow if remittances do not pick up more quickly. Poverty. In developing countries, the crisis affected earnings more than employment. In the aftermath of the crisis, lower growth reduced the rate of poverty reduction in most developing countries, and in many countries, the number of people living in poverty increased. The 2010 Millennium Development Goals report, drawing on newly updated estimates from the World Bank, estimated that an additional 50 million people were living in extreme poverty in 2009 that would have been the case without the crisis, and projected some 64 million by the end of 2010 relative to a no-crisis scenario, principally in Sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern and Southeastern Asia. One of the important impacts was a slowdown in the rate of hunger reduction. Health and education. Jed Friedman and Norbert Shady used household data to help develop an econometric model to project infant deaths and report that our estimates suggest that there will be on the order of 30,000 to 50,000 excess deaths in Africa in 2009. Deaths that would not have taken place had the supreme crisis which began in the United States and not spread to African countries. To find that the bulk of the additional children who will die is likely to be found among poorer households, in rural areas, and those with lower education levels, and is concentrated among girls. Impacts generally differ across countries. Another 2010 study projected deterioration specifically in schooling, child labor, and access to health services in Burkina Faso and on hunger in Ghana. Asia. During the period from September 2008 to March 2009, there was a dramatic slowdown and in some cases, major reversal of the high export growth and GDP growth that the East Asian region, including China, had come to take for granted. The subsequent rebound was strong but uneven. China weathered the initial crisis well, partly due to its own massive stimulus package of almost $600 billion, a much higher share of GDP than the corresponding US package of about $800 billion. the government announced a new strategy of greater reliance on domestic demand for growth. But hallmarks of a housing market and commercial property bubble are being reported in China. The bursting of such a bubble would probably have a significant impact on the global economy. Infrastructure and other investment levels have also been at historically unprecedented levels, with nearly half of output represented in investment in official statistics, but a significant fraction of it apparently yielding low returns. China's economic policymakers appear focused on decreasing reliance on basic exports that rely on processing of imports for modest value added before the export. Improving domestic processing and reliance might also positively affect what is widely viewed as a current imbalance. China and the exchange rates controversy. China also found itself under considerable pressure to allow its currency to increase in value in the aftermath of the crisis. In comments apparently directed as much to the United States as to China, in fall 2010, the finance minister of Brazil announced the world had moved into an international currency war. Brazil then doubled the tax on foreign purchases of bonds to keep its currency. The real, from the appreciating via capital inflows, and other countries, including Japan, intervened to decrease the value of their currencies. IMF Managing Director Dominic Strauss-Kahn said that there is clearly the idea of beginning to circulate that currencies can be used as a policy weapon. Translated into action, such an idea would represent a very serious risk to the global recovery, and any such approach would have a negative and very damaging longer-run impact. East Asia and Southeast Asia other than China. The five high-income economies in the region, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong, remain dependent on exports for growth by global standards, and all experience substantial declines in exports. Expressed in US dollars, exports dropped by 25% with GDP declining between 15 and 30% in the second half of 2008 and first half of 2009. However, just as the scope of the shock was unanticipated, the scale of the subsequent rebound was also surprising. Recovery in middle and low-income countries including Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Thailand was also strong. 3 of these 5 countries reported negative growth after the crisis, but no greater a decline than 2.7%. Demand from China helped raise exports from East and Southeast Asia overall. India. Initially, the Indian economy weathered the financial crisis relatively well. During the crisis, the central government fiscal deficit rose to nearly 7% of GDP. This was in part a planned stimulus to maintain growth during the crisis period. Like most other countries that ran up the fiscal deficit after the crisis, leaders and economic policymakers in India now wish to reduce the deficit substantially, if not run a compensating fiscal surplus for a time. On the other hand, expenditures on poverty programs are increasing, with new government nutrition programs to have a much expanded reach. Some commentators found this a very hopeful sign given the continued severity of poverty in general and malnutrition in particular still prevalent in India. The opposition criticized these programs as a political move intended to influence the 2014 general elections. GDP growth in India fell from its torrid pace of nearly 10% in 2007 to less than 4% in 2008, reflecting the impact of the crisis. It then recovered dramatically to almost 8% in 2009 and to nearly 10% in 2010, the first time growth ever topped 10% in India. But since that time, growth has dropped to about 6.3% in 2011, then to just 3.2% in 2012, with a preliminary estimate for 2013 less than 5%. The manufacturing sector had a full year period of decline, also viewed as a concern for the future was India's growing dependence on energy imports. Even today, however, over half of the labor force in India works in agriculture. Barriers to global finance in India have helped insulate India's still relatively closed economy, but this also suggests there are other untapped gains from trade. India is working to develop more active economic and political relationships with developing countries in Asia and with such nations as Brazil and South Africa. Latin America and the Caribbean. Despite concerns that the crisis would quickly lead to a repeat of past crises in the region, many countries weathered their initial shocks relatively well. Mexico suffered an economic contraction of about 6.5% in 2009 in the wake of the crisis, due to close economic ties in the United States and amplified by the outbreak of the H1N1 flu virus. When the peso was driven to record lows in December 2008, Mexican firms suffered foreign derivative losses. While growth rose to about 5% in 2010, it fell back to less than 4% in both 2011 and 2012. While growth of remittances bounced back and remained strong in most regions, they stayed weak in Latin America and the Caribbean, where growth decelerated due to US economic weakness and policy changes. Argentina was hit hard by the crisis, rebounded very strongly in 2010 and 2011, but then slipped back into slow GDP growth, less than 2% in 2012. Brazil at first weathered the crisis well with 6% growth in 2007 and 5% growth in 2008, in no small part due to the boost from commodity exports, particularly to China, now its largest trading partner. But as its currency, the real appreciated exports were curtailed. After that point, growth was volatile, turning slightly negative in 2009, then surging up to about 7.5% in 2010, but growth then dropped to 2.7% in 2011 and fell below 1% in 2012. Africa. Low levels of trade coupled with relatively high commodity prices for its exports in some ways helped insulate sub-Saharan Africa from the brunt of the crisis. The problem of educated unemployment was exacerbated as new university graduates in the region were having even more difficulty than usual in finding employment that matched their qualifications. This is also true in North Africa and the Middle East, where it was a factor in the Arab Spring revolts. Although commodity prices were off their peaks, they remained relatively high due in significant measure to demand from Asia, and commodity exports continued to fuel growth. If growth in Asia remains high, commodity prices may remain higher than in the previous quarter century. Middle East and North Africa. Recovery has been very sluggish in much of the MENA region, as growth has continued to be slow in the 2011-2013 period in several important countries. This is despite the fact that governments in the region undertook expansionary fiscal policies. Countries that saw the overthrow of their governments during the Arab Spring revolts, namely Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen, are having mixed success at the economic recovery. In 2013, in Egypt, the new turmoil also created economic and political uncertainty and led to a further drop in investment and tourism. The economic breakdown in Syria struck the brutality of its civil war. Even in countries that have not experienced turmoil, some spillovers, including investor perceptions, have led to falls in economic activity. On the other hand, oil exporters have benefited from prevailing relatively high oil prices, albeit well below the pre-crisis peak, even as the economies of oil importers such as Egypt have been negatively affected. In the years following the crisis, international financial institutions and many private forecasters predicted that developing countries would lead a global recovery, which would be a milestone in the history of development. The World Bank, along with the IMF and other forecasters, indicated the risks are to the downside. Indeed, there are at least 5 reasons for caution. Number 1, after growth in the United States, Europe, and Japan remained significantly below historical levels for 6 years following the crisis, and there were doubts that faster growth could resume in most OECD countries for some time to come, even given that recessions after financial crisis historically were deeper and longer lasting than other downturns. Large trade deficits of high-income countries, most notably but not only in the United States, have fallen and seem unlikely to come close to previous heights. The trade balance for Europe as a whole is moving from deficit to surplus. This makes dependence on exports to high-income countries, including the United States, a shaky foundation at present on which to build growth. If growth in major middle-income countries continues to slow significantly in line with forecasts, this puts export-led growth as a development model at greater risk. Number 2, fiscal deficits have been high in virtually all high-income OECD countries, but falling rapidly, reducing demand. Deficits are unlikely to return to previous levels, but in most countries, government debt is now much higher than before the crisis. There is less room for fiscal policy to respond with stimulus in the event of another crisis. Number 3, market perceptions of the risk of sovereign default are high, though in a historic reversal, less so for developing countries on average than for a number of developed countries. A default or major debt restructuring in Europe could threaten the solvency of banks beyond this group, with the potential for a return to broader crisis. Number 4, the risk of deflation, which occurred during the Great Depression and in Japan during its lost decade, remains higher than normal. This compounds any other difficulties of emerging from a new crisis. The quantitative easing in the United States was a response to this risk, but it also led to a lower value of the dollar, a major concern of developing country exporters. The low interest rates in the United States due to quantitative easing also fueled capital outflows to middle-income countries, which may prove temporary after the taper of quantitative easing in 2014 and a possible return to historic interest rate patterns. Number 5, benefits of exporting manufacturers to high-income countries are still present, but the opportunity to do so is threatened due to very slow growth, worsened credit constraints, and perhaps even an increase in disguised protectionism in the developed countries. Such conditions may lead to reduced growth in developing countries and a reduced pace of technology transfer from developed to developing countries. One indicator to watch over the next few years is whether developing countries can continue to rely more on exports to each other, as well as internally generated demand. If they can build on recent trends and make this transition, development may be more rapid and setbacks less likely than has been expected during the crisis or in the decades preceding it. In Chinese symbols, crisis is formed from the symbols for two other words, Wei, a symbol for danger or great peril, and Ji, which can serve as the symbol of opportunity or turning point. Like many difficult translations, scholars differ on what Ji means in this usage, but it introduces a question. Throughout the developing world, the unfolding crisis and its aftershocks were viewed with fear. What would happen to markets for their vital exports? But there is no doubt that many policymakers in China and in other fast-growing developing nations quickly came also to view the crisis as a great opportunity and a critical turning point. As the G8 lost some of its central role, this was paralleled by a relative rise of the G20, a broader group of nations including leading developing countries, whose prominence in the 2008 and 2009 meetings to respond to the crisis was a historic event in economic and political relations between developed and developing worlds. However, after the worst of the crisis abated, the sustainability of a prominent G20 role was unclear. The emergence of China as a possible regional engine of growth could allow less dependence on exports to Western markets, although several countries in the region were also alarmed about China's intentions. And several African nations have become enthusiastic about the emergence of China as a commodities investor as a counterweight to long powerful Western companies. But hopes have been dimmed in many parts of the developing world for open and stable access to developed country markets. Since 2008 crisis, politicians have considered it inexpedient to be viewed as extending concessions on trade. The crisis also revealed to developing countries that despite the assurances of WTO rules, the United States, the European Union, and other advanced regions could effectively get away with reverting to protectionism, at least in the short run, when they found it to be politically expedient. For example, the US stimulus package contained Buy American provisions. These were challenged but for the most part prevailed. Similar requirements were found in the packages of other high-income countries. These serve as sobering reminders that the benefits of exporting the historically more open US, Canadian, UK, and other markets could not be taken for granted. Alternative strategies in domestic demand-led growth and greater reliance on trade between developing countries will also be pursued. The Trans-Pacific Partnership being negotiated would include high-income Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States, and quite possibly Japan, along with developing countries Mexico, Peru, Chile, Malaysia, and Vietnam, plus city-states Singapore and Brunei. Despite a modest WTO accord in 2013, the trend toward negotiating regional trade agreements and circumventing the WTO appears to be accelerating with uncertain ramifications. Overall, recovery in the developing world from the global financial crisis proved far more rapid than many analysts had originally predicted, even as it was worse than expected for many developed countries, particularly in Europe. Yet, as we have seen, many questions remain about the strength and stability of economic growth and development in the coming years.